Hello and welcome to TidyX episode 93. TidyX is a screencast where we go through and explain how our code works. My name is Ellis Hughes. You can find me on Twitter at Ellis_Hughes.
And my name's Patrick Ward. You can find me on Twitter at OSP Patrick. TidyX is on Twitter at tidy_explained. And TidyX is also on Gmail at tidy.explained@gmail.com. Feel free to take out an issue on the GitHub repo or go to the YouTube channel, as most seem to do. Like and subscribe, drop a question, comment in there. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes.
And as always, if you enjoy the work that we're doing, because we enjoy it, and you'd like to buy us a beer or a coffee, we do have a Patreon page. And any and all beers and coffees are greatly appreciated and will be drunk and consumed with a smile on our face.
Exactly. As we create more content for you.
As we create more.
Exactly.
We do better with the beer than we do with the coffee when creating content.
We get more creative. All right,
Yeah.
Episode 93. So for the last couple episodes now, we've been covering Rmarkdown. In the first episode, we covered basic Markdown formatting and how you approach that. The second episode, we talked about chunk options and how you can set those, how you can set them globally or on the specific chunks. And how you can assign them to figure outputs and whatnot. Last week, we looked at a really, really cool trick for setting your tab. I'm totally spacing on tab sets for your headers. And I thought that was super cool about like really making your reports shareable and knowledge, how you can shorten your reports, but really still provide the same amount of information.
It also seems like people on Twitter really like that one. It seemed like that was a popular one, which was cool because I've been using that for maybe a year or two. And I find it super useful. So it's amazing that a lot of people didn't know about it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of cool.
Yeah, no, sharing of information. If you have any tricks that you use and you want to try to get it out and you don't know if it's super common, shoot us an email and we'd love to share that out and really give you a call out on that. Like we said, we like sharing information and hearing from y'all. So this episode, what we're going to be talking about is the YAML header, which we really haven't touched on yet. We've kind of looked at it and said, oh yeah, you can set a table of contents there, and then moved on. Because that wasn't the purpose of those episodes. This week we are going to focus on that mysterious YAML header, those lines, the very top of your Rmarkdown that we go, yeah, and then move on pretty quickly. So let's do that. Patrick, do you have anything to share as I go to share my screen?
Yeah, so last week, obviously, again, we talked about chunk options. That's going to define how the chunks of your code behave and render the output in your Markdown file. The YAML header is really the way that we tell Markdown how we want the document as a whole to behave, how we want it to be outputted, whether we want legends and table of contents, all of these options. And there are oodles of options within the YAML. We're going to go over a few of the more common ones, a few of the more common rendering outputs and things like that, and then show you what those look like. Tons of options here, but this is the way that you get Markdown to do what you want when you're ready to make the finished product.
Yes, exactly. So the YAML header can be found at the very top of all your Rmarkdowns. It's more or less required. There's a couple different standard entries here, but it drives the overall behavior in the rendering of your Rmarkdown. It's not like dealing with the specific chunks and how their behavior is, but it's how do you want code syntax highlighting? Do you want to keep your Markdown output as part of the rendering process? Because typically it just goes from Rmarkdown directly to the output. Do you want to have standard a location where the figures where they're generated? Do you want a location for them to be saved? Table of contents, which we touched on a little bit before. Code folding, lots of behaviors in there. But those are like somewhat more advanced pieces. There are 4 things that you're going to nearly see in every single Rmarkdown document. By default. Like, so when you start up when you create a new Rmarkdown by clicking up here in the upper left and do, okay, I want a new Rmarkdown, and you build this, it's going to have these 4 things here. So the first one is title. So this is the title of the document. It's a string, and it is just what's going to be shown at the very top of your document when it gets rendered. And it can also be used, like if you're creating an HTML output, it's going to put that in the title. So if you open up a new tab, And if you look in your tab at the very top there, it'll show the title of your document in there. Next is author, which is who wrote this. Typically, you'll put your name there, but it could also represent the organization you work for or the group you're in, something along those lines. Next is date. So typically the way they'll format the output is it'll be title, author, date. And so date will be, what date was this report created? So first coded up or rendered. And we'll show you a trick on how you can set that so it'll always set the date that it got rendered as the date option. And then finally, output. So what is the Rmarkdown supposed to be even rendering to? It doesn't know it by default. So you need to, or by default, I think it actually does render to HTML.
But you could change the default. When you opened a new Rmarkdown,
exactly.
There's a little clicker.
Yeah, but this does need to be set. All of these. So one thing to note is these three are kind of optional. You are not required to put these three in entries in your YAML. However, this output is required, as I understand it. So those are the basic components of a YAML header. There's obviously a ton more that you can add, and we'll get to those in a bit. So we keep on saying YAML header. What is a YAML? So YAML stands for yet another markup language. It's kind of a funny, loops back on itself, where it's a formatting structure for the code, just like Markdown, but this time it does it line by line. And so if you're familiar at all with JSON at all, where it has a specific structure to specifying this is a child of this is a child of this, the way YAML works is it uses lines and white space to sort this out. And so each line represents a single entry. And then every time you go down to a new line, that's a new entry. And it assumes that they're all at the same level. So think about the lists, sub entries and lists. So it assumes all of them are at the same level. But as soon as you move over in white space, it starts assuming that is now a child of the whatever is above it, if it's added, if it's less indented. And so white space matters in YAML. And then when you're setting your white space, you need to use spaces, not tabs. I thought that was interesting the first time that I started working with YAML, is I would use tab because then it moves it over 2 spaces. But it needs this white space characters, not a tab. And then one other thing to remember about YAML that I find somewhat tricky at times is true false is lowercase. It is lowercase true and lowercase false. Also, yes and no is true and false. So you can enter yes and it will see that entry as a true, and you can enter no and that will be a false. So I mean that's reasonable. But I've heard of a situation where somebody was entering country codes into their YAML, and the country code for, I believe, Norway is NO. And so it was seeing that as false because they didn't specify that it was a string by putting quotes around it because none of the other ones needed it. So they would be running their code, and all of a sudden their code would come out all garbled because it wasn't seeing the country code NO, it was seeing false, and then it would all fail. So I just wanted to bring that up as a thing to remember when you're working on it. And so this is kind of how you'd format the YAML code. It's not particularly interesting or unique. We've covered that now. But one cool thing about Rmarkdown is it allows you to enter an executable code in line in your YAML header. And so if you want things to change their behavior based on when you render it, or at the time of rendering, you can enter that in. So for example, if you want to have the date list, the date that you clicked render on that report, you can enter in this string here. So it is surrounded by quotes here, and then the backticks to indicate that it's inline R code. And then you have R, which is also still specifying that it's inline R code. And then you have the code that is executable in R. So this is grabbing the sysdate, which is the current date, and dropping that into the date argument in your YAML. Patrick, do you want to cover a little bit about output options?
Yeah, so there's a number of different output options. The three most common that people tend to use are going to be outputting to an HTML doc, which is what we've basically used exclusively up to this point. It's the default setting if you were to open up a Markdown file. People do use PDF documents. If you've read specific, like particularly like some of the research papers in the domain of statistics will sometimes render a PDF document of code and things like that that supplement, let's say, like a statistical method or something like that. So you may have seen that before. And then a Word document, which everybody knows Word and loves Word. It's the traditional word processing document that pretty much everybody uses these days. So those are the three ways that you can render. Those are the three most common ways, I should say. There's other rendering options that are available. You can render to GitHub, MD, ODF. There's a number of community provided rendering. We've done Shireen Gun before. Officer Flex Dashboard. I've built a number of Flex dashboards. We might build one of those later on down the road. Blogdown or Bookdown. Bookdown is a really popular one. I mean, pretty much tons of our books are available in Bookdown, free to the community, like of no cost to you. And they're literally just a massive Markdown file of the entire book.
Yeah, a series of Markdown files.
A series of Markdown files, right.
Yeah.
And so you can find the whole list. The people at our studio have made all of the kind of available output options at that link right there.
Yeah, it's a non-exhaustive list. So this is a list of the ones that have been submitted to them. Is here's an output that I created. Here's the package, and it's on CRAN. But there's a number of ones that only exist in like GitHub too. So, but this is like these are ones that have kind of been vetted, and you can probably count on them existing for a while, like sticking around.
Yeah. So those are some of the output options. Here's an example of what it might look like. You use the double colon there with the package, Flex Dashboard package, to explicitly indicate the output type for the YAML once you knit and render your Markdown file.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this way it can find it. It doesn't know by default that Flex Dashboard comes, or the Flex _ Dashboard comes from Flex Dashboard.
Yeah.
When it comes to rendering, because it hasn't run your R script yet, or your R Markdown yet, and so it needs to have this in there if you're using something outside of R Markdown in order for it to know.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a whole bunch of different options that you have for rendering. Obviously, like all things in R, if you drop a question mark in front of the function, you're going to get the helper window to open up for you. And that helper window will show you the vast number of HTML document functions that you can use. We've used table of contents a little bit before. We're going to add a bunch of things in here today. You can set figure widths and figure heights. You have to do these, even though that does at the top show this as a function with the parentheses. It doesn't work like that within your actual YAML. Within your YAML, as Ellis talked about, you're going to need to set these up similar to, as he referenced, that JSON type of setup, where you're going to need to make these children underneath the actual function that they're detailing. So, for example, here we have a YAML. We're outputting it to our Markdown, specifically an HTML document. So use the semicolon to allow it to find that function. And then instead of using parentheses, you drop another colon in there, and then you're going to put as children of that HTML document each of the arguments. So in this case, we're going to use set a table of contents.
And the depth of the table of contents. Yeah. So these are the different arguments that exist. So the only time you need to actually set these is if there isn't a set value in that function for, so like, the reason I have this HTML question mark document here is so I can see the set of arguments that exist that I could change if I wanted to. Yes. If you want to change them from the default, that's the only time you actually need to enter in a value in here. If it's got a default that you're fine with, leave it. You're fine.
Yeah.
So here, by default, TOC is false, and we wanted it to be true. So we set that in there, and by default, the TOC depth is 3, and we only want it to go 2, so we set it in there. And you can do this for any number of, there's no specific order, you just kind of set it however you want to, and this is now going to be passed on when the document gets rendered. It's going to pass these arguments to the actual function when it gets rendered.
Yep.
So yeah, there's a lot of variety of options that you can run here. It's pretty cool how much power you have, not just now over the specific prose that you write, the code chunks and how it's evaluated, but now how is the actual document output going to be?
Yes. Yes.
So that's kind of a high-level look at the YAML, how it functions, and different things you can do with that. Let's go and actually have a useful example.
Let's make a report.
Let's make a report. So I grabbed the same example that we had from week 2.
91. Yeah, episode 90.
91.
91. Yeah, 91. Yeah.
91. Mm-hmm. Yes, 91. Which is taking some NBA data that we're doing. And so we set a whole mess of YAML headers here, or YAML options here, so we can see how all of them work and behave and look at that. So we set our title to just be NBA. The date is going to be rendered as today's current date. When we click run, the output is going to be in our Markdown HTML document. We set the table of contents to be true because we want there to be a table of contents. We set the depth to be 2 because we only want it to go down to 2 levels here. Granted, this is not a very long or very in-depth example document, but if you have lots of different headers, this would be valuable so you don't go down a rabbit hole of listing literally every single header that exists.
Right.
We're going to set the TOC float option to exist, so it'll be true. So this means the table of contents, last week I believe when we included the table of contents, it was just at the very top, and that's the only place it lived. If you set TOC float to true, or you add some children in here, which you have to read the documentation to, and I'll explain what these specifically do, but if you set these, then it creates a table of contents that floats on the left side of the HTML document that as you scroll, it goes with you, which is pretty nice. We're setting smooth scroll to be true, which I believe it is by default anyway, so I technically didn't need to set that. But this means that it'll slowly move us, when I click on something in the table of contents, it'll move us along in the document rather than just taking us there and then collapsed as false. So this will show the full table of contents by default as opposed to opening and shutting based on which header I am in. I'm going to set code folding. By default, this is false. I want code folding to exist. That is a mouthful. And this is going to allow us to show all the code that we wrote in the HTML output document, but it will collapse it and hide it by default. So that way, if somebody does want to see the actual code that was being used, but we don't want to force everybody to look at it initially, this will hide it by default. And so that's kind of a nice little feature, as well as code download. By default, this is false. I'm going to set it to be true. And this allows people to download. If I were to be sharing just the HTML document, this allows somebody to download the actual RMD that was behind it. Like it includes it in the HTML output. I think it's pretty sweet. So they can download that and look at the actual code that was used to render it. I don't believe, let's not worry about the actual underlying code here.
Yeah. That's just some web scraping to get the data.
Yeah,
I think,
it's web scraping that we've got going on here. We covered this in episode 91, and that's also not the purpose of this code set here. So let's just click knit, and it's now going to be rendering all the code. It scraped everything, and based on my decisions, let's click open browser because I think it looks a little bit nicer. It popped up over here on the left. And so here is our PDF, or excuse me, our HTML output that we've got here. So you can see we have this table of contents that scrolls with us. That's pretty nice. When we click on it, it nicely moves us to the different header as opposed to jumping us around. We've got the code, so we can, by default, it hides the code. but we can click on that and it'll show it all nice and pretty like. And this is only code that gets echoed. So you can still control which code is and is not seen.
Yes. So the code above that one
is hidden.
Yeah. Well, if you click on that, where you were just, what happens if you click that?
This
there
just,
is no.
Yeah, because we didn't
that's
echo
sorry.
it.
That's yeah, exactly. So it doesn't even. It's not there. There's no option to. The top code button is for all of the code. Yeah, all code. That's right.
That we echoed and whatnot.
Yeah,
so that's
correct.
pretty sweet there. And then you can also click download RMD. So now I've now re-downloaded the exact code that I used to render this.
Yep.
So I thought that was pretty cool and shows like the additional level of flexibility and control you can have.
Yeah.
Using this.
That's awesome. Yep.
Let's look at a word output and see how it's slightly different. Patrick, do you want to take us through this one?
Yep. So the YAML here at the top, we're going to put the table of contents equal to true. Obviously, we don't need to have the interactive table of contents info because it's a Word document. It's not an interactive little web page. So figure caption, we're going to put on as yes. And over in the viewer window, you can see the options for this Word document function as well as their corresponding default settings. And then a reference docx is default. What this does is if you had some sort of like style guidelines or some sort of specific styling that you wanted for headers or to be all Gothic print or something like that, you can have this argument in that function point to somewhere where you're storing those point to somewhere where you're storing the styling references, and Markdown will read those and apply those to your actual file once you render it. I honestly have never done that, so I'm not quite sure exactly how it works. Maybe that's something we can try in a different episode, but have you ever done it?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you go through and you create like a template document and you open
like
up
a template Word document.
Yeah, just a Word document, and you edit all the different themes to be exactly how you want it to be for like the different headers and the different you can set like the default font size, font
got it.
all these various things, and you just save that. It's a blank Word document, but you just have set all the theming.
Yes.
And you save that, and then you just provide this link here. So then it'll, rather than using the default docx that is included in our Markdown, it'll use that one to then build off of and add all the content to. And so oftentimes I can think of situations where your company might have specific template, like they provide templates for you to be using, like, hey, whenever you create a header, we want it to be in blue and we want it to be size 30 and we want it to be bolded or something like that, and we want to use a specific company font. That this allows you to do that and use your company's template without you having to generate the Word document and then go back and add it all back in. And so it's kind of nice to be able to do that by default.
Got it. And then with this, we're going to keep all of the other info of the plot the same. Obviously, the plotly will not be clickable, but that's fine. And so we'll see our execution.
Oh, because I have the
info there.
Because
default. There we go.
I had set the wrong reference there. So if you saw it ran all the code, and then it goes, wait a minute, you don't have this reference document.
Yeah.
So now it's rendering.
And here we go. We got a nice little Word document.
Yeah, and it's like fully editable. You can do anything you want here. Blah blah blah. Like it's exactly like a Word document, except now it's already populated with any code that you had from your Markdown header. As you can see here, it's got these settings at the top here. These are the things that you'd have edited.
Yes.
Right. Your code, your plot output. So you could set the figure width and height by default and centering.
Yep.
The caption
Captions.
there, the code, it does split across the pages there.
Yep.
Yeah, and there's your plot. Yes, we weren't, like we said, we weren't focusing on specifically the code itself. We wanted to show how the outputs changed based on the YAML header.
Yeah, the rendering. Yeah.
But yeah, so these are
Cool.
two ways. These are ways that you can interact with and use. So now you've got the formatting in Markdown. You've got the code chunk options settings that you can mess with, and now you've got the ability to specify what type of output are you generating, what behavior do you expect generally. Do you include a table of contents? How do you display at a macro level what's going on there?
That's exact. Yeah, that's it.
So
That's
yeah,
awesome.
so
There you
that
go.
is a basic introduction to YAML headers in your R Markdown and things that you can be setting and changing and working with to make your R Markdown behave the way you want it to. As
There you
always,
go.
thank you for joining us. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing, following us on Twitter at tidy_explained, becoming a patron at Patreon. It's patreon.com/tidy_explained. As always, my name is Ellis Hughes. You can find me on Twitter at Ellis_Hughes.
And my name is Patrick Ward. You can find me on Twitter at OSPPatrick, and you can find TidyX on Twitter at tidy_explained.
Thank you all so much, and keep on exploring your world.